April 12, 1945. Ohrdruf, Germany. General Thaddeus Lockhart walks through the gate, 59 years old, 3 years of war across 2 continents. Commander of the Third Army. A man who has seen boys from Kansas and Ohio die in mud from North Africa to the Rhine. But nothing prepared him for this. The smell hits first. Human decay mixed with lime and gasoline. A stench that crawls into the lungs and refuses to leave. Then the sight. Bodies stacked like cordwood against the eastern wall. Skeletal remains in striped uniforms scattered across the compound. Evidence of systematic murder rendered in flesh and bone. Lockhart takes 3 steps forward. His stomach convulses. He turns to the wall and vomits. Hard, repeatedly, the kind of physical revulsion that strips away rank and dignity and reduces a man to his most basic human response. He wipes his mouth with the back of his hand. This is Ohrdruf, the first concentration camp liberated by American forces. 12 years of the Third Reich concentrated into 11 acres of documented horror. Lockhart straightens, composes himself. His voice when it comes is steady, but something in it has changed forever. Every soldier within 20 miles who is not actively engaged at the front will tour this facility. That is an order. His aide begins to protest. Lockhart cuts him off. Every single one. Then he points to the town visible beyond the trees. The neat German houses with their shutters and flower boxes and willful ignorance. Bring the civilians, the mayor, the shopkeepers, the mothers, everyone. They will see what was built in their backyard. That night, in his tent, Lockhart writes to his wife. His hand shakes as he forms the words. I have seen things today that I cannot describe. I will never be the same man who left you 3 years ago. What we are fighting is not an army. It is an ideology that treats human beings as things to be sorted and discarded. I wept today. I am not ashamed of that. He seals the letter, sits in silence, stares at nothing. The war in Europe has 26 days left. But for Thaddeus Lockhart, something ended today that will never return. May 8, 1945. Germany surrenders. The most destructive war in human history ends not with a heroic last stand, but with surrender documents signed in a schoolhouse. 12 years of the Third Reich collapse into rubble and silence. The logistics are staggering. The United States Army now holds approximately 1.5 million German prisoners of war. Men who commanded divisions, led panzer units across the Soviet steppe, oversaw occupation from Paris to Minsk. These prisoners must be processed, categorized, federal housed, according to the rules of the Geneva Convention. General Lockhart's headquarters are in Bavaria, a commandeered estate that once belonged to a Nazi Party official who fled before the Americans arrived. It is here, in the 3rd week of May, that the complaints begin to arrive. Not from concentration camp survivors. Not from displaced persons wandering across a shattered continent. From German officers, prisoners of war being held in American custody under conditions that, by any objective standard, are humane. The first few complaints are dismissed as aberrations. But then they keep coming. Dozens, scores, hundreds. They arrive typed on paper, submitted through official channels, signed with full rank and name. One morning, Lockhart's aide places a folder on his desk. It is 3 inches thick. Sir, the formal grievances from the POW camps. Lockhart opens the folder. At the top is a complaint from Colonel Friedrich Weber, 48 years old, former artillery commander, 8 years of service to the Third Reich. Weber's complaint is meticulously typed. It cites the Geneva Convention Article 2. It argues that the sleeping arrangements at the Bavarian POW camp constitute inadequate accommodation for officers of his rank. Shared barracks, Weber writes, are appropriate for enlisted men, not for officers who have commanded thousands. The mattresses are insufficient in both thickness and quality. Officers require private quarters to maintain the dignity appropriate to their station. Weber's complaint is 5 pages long. The second complaint is from a major. He objects to the food. American military rations, he argues, are nutritionally insufficient and culturally inappropriate for German officers. He specifically requests that meals be prepared by German cooks using German recipes. He notes that Germany would never subject captured American officers to such dietary indignities. The third complaint concerns hot water. A captain writes that the absence of proper bathing facilities constitutes cruel and unusual treatment. He demands access to showers that meet the standards to which officers of the Wehrmacht are accustomed. Lockhart reads in silence. His face shows nothing. No rage. No amusement. No emotion at all. the officers watching him shift uncomfortably. They have learned to read Lockhart's moods. This absolute stillness is new and unsettling. He turns the page. Another complaint, then another. Requests for better blankets. Demands for heated barracks. Formal objections to the quality of soap provided. 200 German officers have filed complaints in 3 weeks. 200 men whose armies set Europe on fire are complaining about the comfort of their captivity. Lockhart's chief of staff clears his throat. Sir, the camp administrators are requesting guidance on how to respond. Lockhart does not look up. He continues reading. Every single complaint, word for word. When he finishes, he stands, walks to the wall map, studies it in silence. His finger traces a route, north from Bavaria toward Munich, then stops at a point marked with a small annotation. He turns to face the room. Prepare transportation for 200 German officers. Trucks, armed escorts. Tomorrow morning, 0600 hours. His chief of staff hesitates. Sir, what is the destination? Lockhart's finger remains on the map, touching the annotation. Dachau. The room goes silent. Dachau is not a POW facility. It is not a military installation. It is the first concentration camp built by the Nazi regime. Established in March 1933, 12 years of documented systematic terror committed just north of Munich. American forces liberated it on April 29, less than 2 weeks before Germany's surrender. The survivors have been evacuated to hospitals. But the buildings remain. The equipment remains. The evidence remains. Lockhart's chief of staff finds his voice. Sir, that is not a prisoner transfer facility. It is a... I know exactly what it is. Lockhart's tone is quiet, which somehow makes it worse than shouting. Orders stand. 200 officers. The ones who filed these complaints. Every single one of them. Trucks roll at 0600. He turns back to the map. Dismissed. The next morning arrives cold and overcast. 200 German officers are assembled outside their barracks. They have been informed that they are being transferred to a different facility. They are told to bring their personal effects. Colonel Weber stands among them. He exchanges glances with the major beside him. There is something almost like satisfaction in their expressions. Finally, someone has reviewed their complaints. Someone has recognized that the conditions were inappropriate. They are being relocated, presumably to somewhere more suitable for men of their rank and experience. The trucks arrive. American military transports. 20 of them. Canvas-covered beds. Bench seating along the sides. The German officers climb aboard. Some with visible relief. The complaints had been filed through proper channels. The system had worked. As the convoy rolls out through the camp gates, Weber settles onto the hard bench. The truck bed smells of diesel and canvas and the rain that soaked the covering yesterday. Finally, the major beside him mutters in German, "Someone with sense." Weber nods. He has spent 8 years in the Wehrmacht. He understands military administration. When formal complaints are filed correctly, through the proper chain of command, adjustments are made. This is simply the machinery of military justice functioning as designed. The trucks roll through the Bavarian countryside. Spring is struggling to assert itself. The fields that were battlegrounds weeks ago are beginning to show green again. Villages pass by through the canvas flaps. Stone churches, half-timbered houses, the Germany that existed before the war and will exist after. Weber recognizes the terrain. He served in this region before the war. That road leads to Augsburg. That valley runs toward the Isar River. They are heading east, toward Munich. He leans toward the major. We are being taken to Munich. There is a proper military installation there. Officer quarters. A functional mess hall staffed by personnel who understand military protocol. The major nods. It makes sense. The Americans are establishing occupation infrastructure. Of course, they would centralize officer accommodations in a major city. The convoy continues. An hour passes. Then another. The trucks begin to slow. Weber peers through the canvas flap. They have turned off the main road. This is a smaller route. Tree-lined. Quiet. Then he sees the fence. Electric wire. Stretching in both directions as far as the eye can see. Punctuated by guard towers every 100 yards. Tall wooden structures with observation posts and searchlights. Weber's stomach tightens. This is not a military installation. This is something else. The trucks slow further. Make a final turn. And then the gate appears. Massive. Wrought iron. And across the top, in bold German letters that burn themselves into Weber's vision. Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. A slogan designed to mock its prisoners. A lie welded into metal by the same regime Weber served for 8 years. Dachau. The color drains from Weber's face. The major beside him has gone rigid. Further back in the truck bed, someone makes a sound that might be a prayer or a curse. They had thought they were being taken to better quarters. They were wrong. The trucks roll through the gate and stop. The canvas flaps are pulled back. American soldiers order the Germans out. Form them into lines on the gravel road. And there, waiting just inside the gate, stands General Thaddeus Lockhart. Full dress uniform, for stars gleaming on his shoulders. And on his hips, the ivory-handled revolvers that have become his signature. They catch the gray morning light like accusations. Lockhart does not speak immediately. He lets the silence stretch. Lets 200 German officers stand in their lines and look at where they are. At the fence. The guard towers. The barracks visible beyond. At the gate behind them with its grotesque promise. Weber's hands are shaking. He clasps them behind his back. Tries to stand at attention. Tries to find some semblance of the military bearing that defined his adult life. But his eyes keep returning to the gate. To those 3 words. He knows what this place is. Every German officer knows. The rumors were impossible to ignore. But rumors are easy to dismiss. Easy to file away under things that are exaggerated. Things that are propaganda. Standing here, the gate above him, the reality is impossible to dismiss. Lockhart finally speaks. His voice is quiet, almost conversational, which makes it infinitely more terrible than if he had shouted. Gentlemen, you have submitted numerous complaints about your living conditions, about the quality of your food, the comfort of your sleeping arrangements, the adequacy of your sanitation facilities. You have argued that your rank entitles you to better treatment, that you deserve certain standards. Another pause. I brought you here to provide some context. He turns to the American guards. Take them through. The American lieutenant who will serve as guide and translator is waiting near the first barracks. 26 years old. Part of the liberation force 2 weeks ago. His face carries the kind of exhaustion that sleep cannot cure. Lockhart positions himself at the rear of the formation. He does not lead this tour. He watches, studies the faces of 200 men as they are forced to confront what their armies built. The lieutenant begins speaking. His German is precise, practiced. These are the prisoner barracks. According to the original architectural plans, each structure was designed to hold approximately 200 people. He opens the door to the first building. The smell emerges like a living thing, even 2 weeks after liberation. Even with every window opened and the bodies removed. The stench of human misery has soaked into the wood itself. At the camp's peak capacity, these barracks held not 200 prisoners. 1,600. Weber, near the front of the group, stops walking. The major behind him collides with his back. Move forward, the American guard says. Inside, the building is a long wooden structure. 3-tiered bunks line both walls. Raw wooden planks. No matrices. No bedding. No pillows. Nothing but wood. The lieutenant continues in that same measured tone. Prisoners slept in shifts because there was not enough space for every man to lie down simultaneously. They rotated throughout the night. When a prisoner died during his rest period, the body was left in place until the living had completed their rotation. This maintained order. Weber's voice cuts through the silence. Sharp. Defensive. This is clearly exaggeration. No facility would operate under such conditions. It is not logistically feasible. The American lieutenant turns. Looks at Weber for a long moment. The survivors are still in Munich hospitals receiving treatment for starvation and disease. You are welcome to ask them yourself. I can provide you with names and ward numbers. Weber opens his mouth, closes it, says nothing. Lockhart watches this exchange from the doorway, watches Weber's face cycle through denial and anger and something that might be the first edge of understanding. Nobody interrupts again. The tour moves to the roll call square, an open expanse of gravel and dirt where the geometry of control was enacted daily. Prisoners stood here for hours in all weather conditions. Guards counted and recounted. In winter, men died while standing during the count. They were propped against their neighbors so the numbers would remain correct. The count had to be correct. A German captain near the middle of the formation turns away, tries to focus on the tree line beyond the fence. An American guard steps into his line of sight. Eyes forward. The punishment cells are next. Small concrete structures attached to the main barracks. The lieutenant opens one of the doors. 4 feet wide, 7 feet deep. A drain in the floor. No window. No light. Ventilation holes barely an inch across. Prisoners were locked in these cells for days, sometimes weeks. They stood because there was no room to sit or lie down. They were fed nothing or close to nothing. Water when the guards remembered. The walls still bear marks, deep gouges, scratches that start high and descend in frantic patterns. Fingernails, the lieutenant says quietly. Men dug their fingernails into concrete. Weber stares at the scratches. His hands, still clasped behind his back, are white-knuckled. Lockhart moves closer, close enough to see the tremor that has started in Weber's shoulders. The way his breathing has become shallow and irregular. This is what Lockhart came to witness. Not the buildings, not the equipment, the moment when certainty collapses, when the comfortable distance between action and consequence disappears. The medical experimentation wing occupies a separate building. Inside, documentation still covers the walls. Typed reports, photographs pinned to cork boards, charts tracking variables in human suffering. The lieutenant's voice remains steady, but something beneath it has gone cold. Medical experiments were conducted on living prisoners without anesthesia. Hypothermia tests, altitude chamber trials, disease inoculation. Human beings were used as laboratory equipment and discarded when the data had been collected. He points to a photograph. A man strapped to a table, ice water surrounding his body, thermometers protruding from various points. A doctor in a white coat taking notes. These experiments were meticulously documented. The researchers published papers, submitted findings to medical journals. This was not improvised cruelty. This was systematic inquiry using human subjects who could not consent and could not refuse. A German officer near the wall turns his face away. The guard steps forward. Voice hard. No. You look. The officer looks. Lockhart watches the major who complained about culturally inappropriate food. Watches the man's face go gray. Watches him grip the doorframe for support. The crematoriums are the final stop. Even from outside, the scale is apparent. Industrial structures, built with the same engineering precision that Germany applied to autobahns and factories and weapon systems. The ovens inside are massive, brick and steel, multiple chambers, designed to operate continuously. The lieutenant's voice has dropped almost to a whisper. These operated around the clock. Bodies were burned in shifts. The system was planned, engineered, budgeted, and built by contractors who submitted invoices and received payment through standard administrative channels. The systematic murder of human beings was rendered as a logistics problem and solved with German efficiency. Several officers are weeping now. Not dramatically, just tears sliding down faces gone slack with horror. One man vomits in the corner. Weber stands motionless, staring at the oven doors. His lips are moving but no sound emerges. Lockhart observes it all. 200 men whose complaints about mattresses had seemed so reasonable on paper, so justified, now standing in the infrastructure of genocide. This is the context he promised them. But Lockhart has arranged one final element. Outside the crematorium building, figures are waiting. Dozens of them. Some in the striped uniforms that have become the visual signature of Nazi atrocity. Some in donated civilian clothes that hang off skeletal frames. Some lean on canes. Some can barely stand without support. These are survivors. Former prisoners now living in displaced persons camps in the surrounding area. They were asked if any wanted to come. If any wanted to see the men who commanded the armies that imprisoned them. Dozens volunteered. They stand in silence. They do not shout. Do not accuse. They simply look at the 200 German officers. That silence is more devastating than any accusation could be. Then one man steps forward. He is 68 years old. His face is all angles and shadows. His eyes carry something ancient and unbreakable. His name is Aaron Stern. He raises one trembling hand and points directly at Colonel Friedrich Weber. When Stern speaks, his German carries the accent of Poland. Of a world that no longer exists. I know you. Weber goes rigid. Labor camp selection. Poland. Autumn of 1943. You stood on the platform when the trains arrived. You chose who would work and who would go to the chambers. Weber's voice emerges hoarse. Barely audible. I was following orders. I did not design the system. I was a soldier following lawful commands from legitimate authority. Stern takes a step closer. His eyes never leave Weber's face. My son was in that group. 12 years old. Too young to work. You looked at him. You pointed left. Toward the trucks that went to the gas chambers. Weber is shaking his head. Small rapid movements. Denial without words. Stern's voice drops to something just above a whisper. I remember your face, Colonel, because you smiled when you pointed. You smiled. The words hang in the cold air like an indictment written in fire. Weber cannot speak, cannot move, cannot do anything but stand there while a man who lost everything names him, identifies him, removes every layer of abstraction and bureaucratic distance. More survivors step forward. More identifications, specific dates, specific locations, specific acts committed by specific officers in this formation. The Germans who try to deny are met with names of other witnesses still living. Documentation that survived. Testimony that was recorded. The evidence surrounds them on all sides. Denial becomes impossible, like standing in a burning building and insisting there is no fire. Lockhart watches Weber's face. Watches the exact moment when the colonel's entire framework collapses. When following orders stops being a shield and becomes an admission. After 3 hours, Lockhart calls it to an end. He moves to the front of the formation, assembles the German officers in the roll call square, the same ground where prisoners stood for daily counts, where men died standing and were propped upright to keep the numbers correct. Lockhart's voice when he speaks is quiet, but it carries across the square with absolute clarity. You complained about your food. You just stood in a place where men fought each other for potato peels and died of starvation, while German guards ate full meals 50 yards away. Pause. You complained about your beds. You just saw where 1,600 men slept on bare wooden shifts because there was not enough space for human dignity. His eyes move across their faces, finding each man. You complained about your dignity. You just saw where human dignity was destroyed as a matter of deliberate state policy. Where people were reduced to numbers tattooed on their skin, starved, worked until they collapsed, and murdered for the crime of being born. The longest pause yet. You are officers in the army that built this. You swore oaths to the regime that designed this. You led men who stood guard over this systematic destruction of human life. And then you had the audacity to complain to me about cots and rations. Silence. You want to know if you are being treated fairly? He lets the question hang. You are alive. You are fed. You are receiving more basic human decency than you extended to a single person who ended up in this camp. If you cannot understand why that is already more than you deserve, then you have learned nothing today. Lockhart turns to the guards. Take them back. The trucks drive west through the Bavarian countryside in absolute silence. Not one word spoken. Not one sound except the diesel engines and the canvas flapping in the wind. Weber sits on the hard bench. His hands are in his lap. He stares at them as though they belong to someone else. The major beside him has his eyes closed. But tears leak from the corners. When the trucks roll back through the POW camp gates, the German officers climb out and walk to their barracks in that same terrible silence. They sit on their cots. The mattresses they had complained about. They say nothing. The formal complaints stop. Immediately, permanently, not one written grievance is filed after that day. The American guards notice something else in the days that follow. The 200 officers eat everything on their plates. They waste nothing. Some are seen carefully saving bread from their meals, setting pieces aside. The reflexes of starving people, even though they are not starving. Old reflexes learned in a single afternoon. 72 hours after the tour, a different kind of complaint moves up the American chain of command. Not from German officers this time, from American ones. A judge advocate general officer has reviewed the incident, filed a formal objection. The memorandum is 7 pages long, typed, footnoted, citing specific articles of international law. The core argument: forcing prisoners of war to visit a site of atrocity, regardless of the site's historical significance, constitutes psychological coercion in violation of Geneva Convention Article 2. The JAG officer has done his homework. He cites precedents, attaches legal analysis. He recommends that General Lockhart be formally reprimanded, and that the United States issue a public statement distancing itself from the action. The memorandum reaches Brigadier General Walter Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff. Smith reads it, passes it to Eisenhower. Eisenhower reads it and says nothing publicly for 4 days. During those 4 days, the memorandum circulates among senior staff, grows into a genuine institutional crisis. Lockhart is summoned to a meeting in Frankfurt. May 24th, 9 days after the tour. He arrives in full uniform, for stars, ivory revolvers, the complete theater of General Thaddeus Lockhart at maximum presence. Sitting across the conference table are 3 senior officers and 2 civilian advisors from the State Department. One of the civilians speaks first. His voice carries the careful precision of a man trained to navigate political minefields. General Lockhart, the State Department has concerns about the precedent this action establishes. We are in the early stages of developing the post-war legal framework for war crimes prosecution. Actions like yours, however well-intentioned, could be used by German defense attorneys to argue that American forces subjected their clients to psychological torture before any formal charges were filed. Lockhart looks at the man for a long moment. Then he speaks, voice calm, almost casual. You are telling me that showing German officers what German officers did might make it harder to prosecute German officers for what they did. The civilian shifts in his chair. I am telling you that the rule of law requires consistency. We cannot selectively apply it based on our emotional response to what we have seen. Lockhart leans back. I do not have an emotional response. I have a factual one. I showed them facts. I showed them a building. I showed them what was inside the building. I showed them people who identified them by name and deed. If the law says that showing a man the consequences of his actions constitutes cruel treatment, then the law has a problem I am not qualified to fix. The meeting lasts 2 hours. No resolution is reached. No reprimand issued that day. But the pressure is real. And building. For a man who has already been relieved of command once in his career, another official reprimand could end everything. Lockhart's enemies in Washington are watching, waiting, and the question hanging over everything: did General Thaddeus Lockhart have the legal and moral authority to do what he did? Lieutenant Colonel Silas Brennan is 34 years old, a former civil rights attorney from Chicago who spent the war working in Army legal affairs. He is not a combat officer, has never commanded troops in battle. He wears glasses, speaks softly, possesses the kind of methodical intelligence that makes him completely invisible in a room full of generals. But Brennan has been part of the Dachau liberation team. He has processed survivor testimony for 3 weeks after the camp was liberated. He has documentation that no one else in the room has read. On May 25th, Brennan approaches Lockhart's chief of staff with a single request. Give me 15 minutes to present a legal counterargument before any reprimand is finalized. The chief of staff studies this quiet man with his wire-rimmed glasses and his briefcase full of documents. You have 30. The meeting is convened the following morning. Same conference room in Frankfurt. Same senior officers. Same State Department civilians who argued that Lockhart's action undermined the rule of law. Brennan enters carrying 3 folders. Sets them on the table with care. Removes his glasses. Cleans them. Replaces them. Then he begins. Gentlemen, the objection to General Lockhart's action rests on Geneva Convention Article 2, which prohibits coercion against prisoners of war. The memorandum argues that forcing POWs to visit Dachau constitutes psychological coercion. Brennan opens the first folder. Article 2 prohibits coercion intended to extract information or confessions. I have the complete text here. It says nothing about educational visits to historical sites on German soil. Nothing about requiring prisoners to witness the consequences of the regime they served. He slides the document across the table. Furthermore, British forces have conducted similar tours of liberated camps with German prisoners. Bergen-Belsen. Nordhausen. I have documentation of 2 separate instances. No formal objection was filed by any international body. No violation was cited. Second folder. The International Committee of the Red Cross has reclassified the Dachau site, post-liberation, as a historical preservation site under American military jurisdiction, not an active detention facility. Forcing prisoners to visit a historical site is not coercion under any existing legal definition. Brennan pauses, looks at each person in the room. General Lockhart did not extract confessions. He did not threaten. He did not harm. He showed them a place, explained what happened there, and allowed survivors to speak. The State Department civilian attempts to interject. Brennan holds up one hand. I am not finished. He opens the third folder, removes a stack of papers. The original complaints filed by the German officers. Weber's 5-page objection about mattresses. The major's demand for German food. The captain's grievance about hot water. Brennan begins to read. Out loud. Every word. Weber's complaint about shared barracks being inappropriate for officers of his rank. How the mattresses lacked sufficient thickness. How private quarters were necessary to maintain dignity appropriate to his station. The major's complaint about American rations being nutritionally insufficient and culturally inappropriate. How Germany would never subject American officers to such dietary indignities. The captain's formal objection to the absence of hot water constituting cruel and unusual treatment. Brennan reads in a flat, steady voice. No commentary. No editorializing. Just the words themselves. When he finishes, the silence in the room is absolute. Brennan carefully places the complaints back in the folder. Looks up. If we reprimand General Lockhart for showing these men what their regime built, we are formally declaring that their comfort matters more than what happened 50 yards inside that gate. I do not think that is the statement the United States Army wants to make in May of 1945. He closes the folder. Sits down. The reprimand is shelved that afternoon. Lockhart receives a private communication from Eisenhower's office. Not a rebuke, not an endorsement, but a clear message. Do not do it again without authorization. The institution has accepted what Lockhart did. Barely. And the margin for improvisation has shrunk to almost nothing. But the decision stands. The tour stands. Colonel Ellis Whitmore commands the camp where the 200 officers are being held. 45 years old. Career military administrator. A man trained to observe patterns in human behavior and document deviations. In the weeks following the Dachau tour, Whitmore files regular reports on the behavioral changes he observes in the 200 officers who participated. The group has become notably cooperative with camp administration. Work details are completed without resistance. Meal distribution, previously a source of constant friction, has become orderly. But it is the smaller details that Whitmore finds most striking. The officers eat everything on their plates. Waste nothing. Several have been observed saving bread from their meals, carefully wrapping pieces in cloth, setting them aside. The automatic behavior of people who have seen real starvation, even though they themselves are not starving. Whitmore notes in his October report that several officers have requested access to reading materials, specifically historical documents and newspaper accounts of the Nuremberg Charter, the legal framework being assembled for war crimes prosecution. They want to understand what is coming. They are no longer pretending the war was merely an unfortunate inconvenience. Something in them has shifted. December of 1945. Snow falls across Bavaria. The first winter of peace in 6 years. Colonel Friedrich Weber comes to Whitmore's office one afternoon. Unannounced. He knocks, waits for permission to enter. Whitmore looks up from his paperwork, studies Weber's face. The man who complained about his mattress 6 months ago looks different now. Thinner, older. Something in the eyes has changed.
Colonel Weber.
What can I do for you? Weber sits, clasps his hands in his lap, is silent for a long moment. Then, in careful English, he speaks. Is an officer who transmitted orders he believed to be lawful, but which were not lawful, guilty of a crime? Whitmore sets down his pen. That is what the Nuremberg Tribunal is deciding, Colonel. I am not qualified to answer legal questions of that magnitude. Weber nods slowly, looks at his hands. Another long silence. I transmitted many orders. Whitmore writes in his report later that evening. I did not respond. There was nothing appropriate to say. October of 1946. The Nuremberg verdicts have been delivered. 12 death sentences, 7 prison terms, 3 acquittals. The executions are carried out on October 16th in the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison. German officers across the POW camps follow the news through whatever newspaper access American administration allows. The 200 who went to Dachau maintain their orderly and cooperative behavior. Several have requested pastoral counseling. 3 have made written statements to American legal officers regarding their activities during the war. Without prompting, most of the German officers are being processed for release now. The war has been over for 18 months. Germany is rebuilding under occupation authority. The camps are emptying. Colonel Weber is among those scheduled for repatriation in late October. On his final day, he comes to Whitmore's office to return his camp identification card. Standard checkout procedure. He places the card on the desk. Then he reaches into his jacket, removes something, places it beside the card. A small piece of paper, folded carefully, many times. I wrote this in the camp. I would like someone to keep it. Weber does not wait for a response. He turns and leaves. Whitmore watches him go, then carefully unfolds the paper. Inside, in neat German script, 12 names are written, first and last, carefully formed letters. Below the names, a single sentence. These were people I could have helped and did not. Whitmore sits at his desk for a long time, staring at the paper, at the 12 names, at that one devastating sentence. Later, in his private notes, he writes an addendum that will never be filed officially. I do not know if this constitutes confession, penance, or simply record-keeping. I am not qualified to judge. The nature of what is happening in this camp is beyond the scope of a behavioral report. I leave it for historians to assess. I kept the paper. He folds it carefully, places it in an envelope, files it with his personal documents. General Thaddeus Lockhart never sees the Nuremberg verdicts. On December 21st, 1945, his staff car is struck by a military truck on a 2-lane road near Mannheim, Germany. A routine collision at low speed. No enemy fire. No dramatic battlefield death. Lockhart sustains a cervical spinal fracture. He dies 12 days later in an American military hospital in Heidelberg. 60 years old. He has survived 3 years of combat across 2 continents. Has commanded the Third Army through some of the most intense fighting in modern warfare. Has liberated concentration camps. Has made decisions that saved thousands of lives and cost thousands of others. and then dies quietly in a hospital bed because a truck turned into his car on an ordinary December afternoon. His personal effects are shipped home to his widow. Among them, his journals. Hundreds of thousands of words documenting his experiences, his thoughts, his struggles with command and conscience. In all those journals, across all those years of extraordinary documented self-reflection, the Dachau tour appears in exactly 2 sentences. Took a group of the complaining officers to see the camp. They will not complain again. That is all. No elaboration. No moral commentary. No sense that he understood he had done something that would outlast everything else he ever did. His ivory-handled revolvers are preserved in a military museum. His dress uniform behind glass. His journals archived. But Lockhart never knew that the instinct he acted on in May of 1945 would become the philosophical foundation of an entire academic discipline. Transitional justice, the formal process by which societies reckon with mass atrocity. Studied in law schools and conflict resolution programs across the world for the next 8 decades. Show them. Do not argue. Make them stand in the place where decisions became consequences. Lieutenant Colonel Silas Brennan, the quiet lawyer who saved Lockhart's decision from being officially repudiated, returns to Chicago in 1946. He resumes his civil rights practice. Spends the next 30 years working primarily on housing discrimination cases in Illinois. Important work. Unglamorous. The kind of grinding legal effort that changes lives one case at a time. He never writes about Nuremberg. Never lectures on international law. Never seeks recognition for the role he played. In 1971, he gives one interview to a University of Chicago law student writing a thesis on the origins of the Nuremberg Principles. In that interview, he mentions the Frankfurt conference room, the stack of complaints he read aloud, the silence that followed. The thesis is filed in the university library and largely forgotten. Brennan dies in 1988. His obituary in the Chicago Tribune runs 4 sentences. It mentions his civil rights work, his service in the war. It does not mention Dachau, or the decision he protected with a 30-minute legal argument in May of 1945. Colonel Ellis Whitmore is discharged in 1946, returns to rural Ohio, becomes a high school history teacher. He teaches for 23 years. Former students later recall that he never discussed the war in class. Not once. When asked why, he reportedly said, "Because I watched men who had done terrible things sit in a camp for a year and a half and figure out whether they felt bad about it. I do not think that story has a satisfying ending for a classroom." The 200 German officers disperse into the rubble and reconstruction of post-war West Germany. Most become ordinary citizens, rebuild businesses, raise families. The West German government, under enormous pressure to staff a functioning civil service, employs thousands of men with Nazi-era records in administrative positions. A deliberate compromise between idealism and the practical necessity of having enough educated bureaucrats to run a country. Some of the 200 may have been among them. The records are incomplete. Colonel Friedrich Weber goes home, disappears into ordinary post-war life. Almost none of the 200 ever publicly discuss the May 1945 tour to Dachau. But the idea they were exposed to does not disperse. Travels. In 1948, the United Nations General Assembly unanimously affirms the Nuremberg Principles as a permanent part of international legal order. The precedent that Lockhart acted on instinctively is codified into civilization's operating rules. The people who make decisions that destroy other people's lives must be required to face those lives directly. The comfortable distance between decision and consequence is not a natural feature of reality. It is constructed, and it can be taken away. Georgetown University, Washington, D.C., 2019. A graduate student researching American military government records from the post-war occupation period discovers a collection of digitized files. Among them, Colonel Ellis Whitmore's complete series of behavioral reports from the POW camp. All 17 months of documentation, archived since 1948, never cited in any published historical work. In the final report, the one filed in October of 1946 after the Nuremberg verdicts, the student finds something. A handwritten addendum, not included in the official version, but present in Whitmore's personal copy, donated to the Ohio Historical Society by his daughter in 1994. In it, Whitmore describes his final conversation with Colonel Weber, the returned identification card, the folded piece of paper left on the desk. The paper is still there, enclosed with the report, preserved, 12 names written in careful German script. These were people I could have helped and did not. The graduate student photographs it. The 12 names have never been publicly released, out of respect for surviving family members who may not know this history. But the document exists, from a stack of mattress complaints to 12 names on a folded piece of paper. From one general's instinctive fury to the foundation of international humanitarian law. From 200 men who thought their rank entitled them to comfort to one man who understood, finally, that rank had entitled him to responsibility, and that he had failed it. General Thaddeus Lockhart was right about one thing. You cannot argue a man into reckoning. You have to take him there. You have to make him stand in the place where his decisions lived. And you have to make him look. The world has spent 80 years building institutions to do exactly that. Tribunals for Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, Sierra Leone, Cambodia, dozens of post-atrocity contexts where the methodology Lockhart used instinctively has become formal practice. Physical confrontation with evidence, in the actual location where atrocity occurred, with survivors present. The field of transitional justice now employs thousands of lawyers, psychologists, documentary filmmakers, and community facilitators, working in active conflict zones and post-conflict societies around the world. None of them cite Lockhart as a founding figure. He was a general, not a jurist. But the truth he acted on in a Bavarian POW camp in May of 1945 has traveled further than anyone could have imagined. Because it turns out that one 3-hour tour was not enough, and will never be enough. Accountability is not punishment. It is the act of making the invisible visible, the abstract concrete, the decision and its human cost inseparable from each other. Lockhart understood that. The survivors who stood in that camp understood that. Silas Brennan understood that. Colonel Friedrich Weber, in the end, understood that. And now you understand it too. The distance has been closed. The paper with 12 names still exists in an archive in Washington, D.C. A man who complained about his mattress in May of 1945 left behind 12 names. People he could have helped and did not. From mattress complaints to that folded piece of paper. From one general's decision to the foundation of how civilization holds powerful men accountable. The story is complete. The reckoning continues. Now you know.